Hi, my name is Sam,
And I'm Andrew.
and this is Teens Talk Politics. In today's episode, we're going to be covering a bit more of a relevant subject. Today, we're going to be covering the Olympics, its history, and kind of the way it's played into international and national politics. And it's kind of it's surprisingly plays well into reflective of how America is on the world stage at times and what it kind of represents. And so that's a very kind of why we're doing this. But I think first we're going to start off with a brief history of the Olympics. Now, the Olympics, as we all know, the began in Olympia, Greece, where different city-states would come and compete against a few ancient kind of sports. And at this time, it was relatively small, and as we know, only in the territories of Greece that happened. But soon enough, it came to dull down after ancient Greece didn't become so ancient, and after the Greek Civil War, I believe, or Greek War of Independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1821. Soon enough, in 1856, they founded the Olympic Games, sponsored by Zappos, the shoe company, in 1859, as I said. And from then on, the Olympic Games were held in Athens until 1990, until 1890, where the International Olympic 1896, where the International Olympic Committee took over and began rotating it through countries. And at the time, the International Olympic Committee, the guy who was in charge was George Averoff. He was kind of a very, very big donator, but the person who was in charge was Konstantinos Zappos, as he left the Greek government to trust fund the Olympic Games. And later on, it more and more developed. The Winter Games appeared in the early 1900s, and soon enough, the Youth Games in 2010, and the Paralympics in 1948. Where obviously when the Paralympics, it was more different of a time, but that's besides the point. Though it has played into politics severely when was obviously the recent scandal of the Russian government forcing their athletes to take drugs, and far before, when Japan and Germany were blocked from competing in the Olympics after just post World War II era. So as we know, it's very significant into international politics and can sometimes represent what a country stands for in some of these in these games, and so it's pretty significant. What are your thoughts on the significance of the Olympics, Andrew?
Well, like you said, it really represents what the country is. For example, like you said, Russia was banned from the Olympics because they were putting steroids in their athletes, and that really shows you what the government of Russia is doing in the country. But then you have states like China, which are very good at the synchronized diving, which doesn't surprise you because it's a communist nation where you're supposed to be the same. You don't get property, you can't own property, it's all owned by the government, and there are certain things you cannot do, so everyone's very similar. So it makes sense that certain games in the Olympics would be very good at in certain countries like China, a communist nation.
Yeah, it's kind of stereotypical as the United States is very good at marksmanship, which is kind of funny. Very reflective of the United States.
And then countries with these larger populations like China and the United States, they did very well because they could be very selective in the athletes that they were choosing. Of course, it's not always true because there are smaller nations like the Netherlands that do very well in the Olympics, and they don't have as big of a population as countries as of China or the United States. And I think it really shows you and solidifies people's opinions on certain countries, whether it be the United States, whether it be Russia, whether it be China. Like, I think it's kind of humorous to think that Russia is not allowed in the Olympics, but North Korea is. When North Korea is a nation that solidifies all their population, it's a communist nation. While Russia says it's a democracy, but Putin's been in power for I don't know how many years, very, very long time. So it's kind of interesting to see really who they ban and who they not, with Russia being one of the only countries that have been banned, and it's because they cheat in the games, which North Korea, like I said before, is allowed and hasn't been shown to have cheated before. So I think this really shows you, as I mentioned before, what the countries really are and what they stand for, just through how they act in the Olympic Games.
Very accurate. So yeah, and so yeah, it was a good point you mentioned about how it does reflect, like with China's synchronized diving and stuff like that. So, and it's kind of weird as the International Olympic Committee, as further recognized as the IOC, will like continue to be a bit confusing in their logic behind who do they support and when do they support it. But it's a very political drive-in sports event, international sports event, and so every 4 years or 2 or 4 years when it comes around, depending on how you look at it, you it's a pretty big deal. I'm sorry, but so I think anything you have to say before we move on to our next subject, or
I think we can move on, and then the next thing is going to be talking about athletes and what they stand for, specifically in the United States, because this is a big topic where there are more progressive athletes that have spoken out against the former president, more conservative media, and they kneel for the national anthem and stuff like that, and some of them did compete in the Olympics. And this ties right into our next bullet point. We'll go back to what I just was talking about, but this also leads right into what we said, and this is about Trump specifically targeting the women's soccer team because they were staunchly against Trump's policies and his character himself. And I want to read a quote that he said. He said, "Wokeism makes you lose." The U.S. women's soccer team is a very good example of what's going on, he continued, shaking his head with a smirk as the crowd booed loudly. Earlier this week, they unexpectedly lost to Sweden 3-0, and Americans were very happy about it, he said. A line that drew laughs and cheers enough for Trump to quickly add, "You proved that point before I even said it." So he's directly targeting people in the Olympics that are representing the U.S. on the international stage. And I think this is a very weak point because all Americans are supposed to stand behind the athletes that they send out into the international world stage in Tokyo. Because it represents the country, obviously. And for Americans to be against certain people that are representing them I think it's not a very good point, and it doesn't show how America really is on the international world stage. And I think Trump really should rethink his comments about that. It doesn't matter whether or not you agree what these people think about certain issues and on social topics. That doesn't mean you should be against everything they do and then disregard their representation of the United States on a national scale, even making people boo their own athletes. So Sam, do you have any thoughts?
yeah, it's just kind of absurd that someone would do this to people, as you're saying, that are sent out into the international world stage, and it's very unfair for these athletes who have worked very hard to support the United States in their athletic foundings in the world, for people like our former president to talk down to them and calling them bad, booing them for doing something that was simply for the good of the nation and kind of a healthy-hearted just sports competition. Nothing meant, no bad feelings, just Like, they didn't try to lose, I'm sure, and so don't boo them. Like, it's like they did the best they can, and this is
Right.
not a big deal. It's just some sports people, and by the way, you guys sent them out to represent us in the Olympics, and so you should be supporting them either way, because they're your fellow country people, and I feel like that's very important.
Yeah, because the United States will send the best of the best in the country to go represent them on the international scale and to win as many medals, gold medals as possible. And we were successful in that, winning the most gold medals out of all the other countries in the world.
Mm-hmm.
But to be staunchly against someone representing us on the international world stage probably isn't a good look for America. And it probably should change, especially for my former leader of the United States. It would have been okay, probably not great, if a more local leader, maybe a United States representative, or maybe even a senator said that, but the fact a former president said that, someone that was formerly on the international world stage, went to go meet with world leaders, met with other countries, and for them to bash their own athletes isn't a good look for America.
Mm-mm. So I think we're gonna jump back to what we skipped forward a bit earlier about our athlete social issues, which kind of ties into what we just talked about the Trump issues against the women's soccer team. But a lot of the time, especially in female athlete divisions, that it's been very hard for some teams to be recognized and some skills to be aged, as we know. Back in history, that people of color weren't allowed to compete in the Olympics on behalf of the United States for a long time, and nor were women. And so these social issues are still being developed, and it's much harder for a woman of color to get in the Olympics than it is for a white man to rise to the top of that occasion. So it's so it's
it depends on
there's
who
a
you're
lot of
going through. Right?
huh. Well, obviously, but generally speaking, it's much harder for someone to get to that Olympic level, especially where they came from. A lot, like especially fighting a lot of these again social issues, in these constructs based on some of these political statements made by some of our former presidents. Obviously, as we were previously talking about the women's soccer incident, but it's also just because of the way our country has been made up, that it's a very difficult situation for it to get more support as, for example, of a woman of color in the Olympics.
Well, when you mentioned it's more difficult for someone of color or someone that's black versus someone that's white, I think it's gotten much better than it used to be.
Certainly, but there's still plenty to work on.
Well, people are aware now.
Mm-hmm.
There are people that are involved in picking the athletes and who goes out to Japan. They're very aware of these issues, and I think they put that into consideration when they pick an athlete.
What I'm saying is it's not these pickers' fault. It's the support they get from the United States citizens, and that is kind of, I think, the biggest issue is because some of these people in the United States aren't supporting their athletes either financially for getting into the Olympics, because the Olympics are surprisingly expensive, not like the admission fee or anything, but like just to support an Olympic athlete, they don't get paid or anything, but it's, I think, just back at home, it's a lot more difficult for these athletes to keep their footing even after this hard work they do, especially, as I was saying, if they were a woman of color or things like this, like a person of color. And I think that's a very big issue when it's not, I'm sure, recently it hasn't been the people who pick to send out these athletes' fault, but it's really mostly, especially with the Biden administration, but it's really mostly some of the American people who are not supporting these athletes. And
well, there are certain American citizens that don't support the athletes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the people that are choosing the athletes are going to
Oh,
be
no.
discriminating
No, that's not what
against.
I'm saying. What I'm saying, it's harder for them to get to that point because of this discrimination.
Well, it depends on the levels you're going through.
Yes,
It
but
depends on
obviously
it.
to the Olympic level.
It's the Olympic level, yes, and I understand where you're coming from. If you're getting to that level of when you're becoming a professional, whatever sport you're involved in, and then they choose you to go to the Olympics, yes, but going from that professional level to the Olympic level, I think is the same for any race. However, I think on the ways up, yes, you could see disadvantages, but I think it's more financial than it is racial. It
I
used
mean,
to be a lot more racial than
obviously, the only
financial.
damage that could happen is kind of maybe the pride of this athlete, as the instance of the women's soccer incident in Trump, as we were talking about earlier. But it's obviously it's that it's the fact that they don't have a lack of financial they have a lack of financial support, social support for the work they put in to become an Olympic athlete
And I will
because
also,
unfortunately a lot of the time of their skin color. But
and I will also say, it depends on the sport you're talking about. Because, for example, the NBA, a lot of their players supported Black Lives Matter, and that's a very obviously that's a racial issue. And for
yeah,
a very large quantity of players to be supporting this issue, then you're going to need a lot of players of diversity, which wouldn't happen unless there was a real racial issue within the NBA. Of course, there has been gender discrimination against male and female, with males getting priorities over the females, which has been a big issue. However, I don't think there's been a big racial issue in the NBA. However, you find places like baseball where it's very predominantly white, and there's many sports like that where I think there could be a racial issue, but I think it completely depends on the sport you're talking about. And like I mentioned earlier, I think there's a really, really big gender difference, and I think there's a bigger gender difference than there's a racial one. For example, football doesn't even have a women's version of it, which almost every other sport does nowadays. For example, soccer, not soccer. Well, soccer does, but I'm talking about basketball. Basketball has the NBA and the WNBA, the women's version, which doesn't exist for the NFL. Of course, I don't follow sports that much, so I don't really know what I'm talking about as much as some people would. However, I think there's much larger gender difference than there is a racial difference.
yeah. I mean, and I'm not pushing that, but I'm just giving an example of gender discrimination.
Yeah. And I think on to the last thing is how it works on the international world stage when you're hosting the games. For example, Tokyo, they were the host this time, and it's Beijing in 2022, and then Paris is going to be doing it in 2024. And almost all countries, if they had the opportunity to host the Olympics, it's very expensive to host it, however, it does benefit the country very heavily. For example, in Tokyo, their economy was booming because all the tourist attraction, all the people visiting to go to the games, everyone's spending money while they're in Japan. It helps the economy very, very significantly. And for example, when it's in Paris, it's going to do the same thing to France. When it's in Beijing, the economy is going to go better in China as it would in Tokyo this time around. And like I said, it attracts tourists, which is a good thing for any country. Many towns and some states in the United States, they get a lot of their money because tourists come to their state. Florida beaches get a lot of money from tourists spending money at those beaches. Things like this. And that's a good example in Tokyo, how a lot of people, the country is getting a lot of economic growth just because all these tourists, the games being hosted in Tokyo, people spending money there, and it becomes a international landmark, at least temporarily. Of course, Tokyo is normally. However, it grows in popularity anyways because the Olympics are being held there, and it's very internationally important for a sustained temporary amount of time for, I guess it's been longer than normal just purely because the Olympics have been postponed until 2021, which they're still called the 2020 Olympics just because they don't want to mess up the calendar. But I really think it's very good for the countries to have it held there, and I think most people understand that. For example, the United States has held it several times, and it's brought economic growth to the country. It was in Rio in 2016. It brought a lot of economic growth there. So, Sam, do you have any thoughts on how it really affects countries when the Olympics are hosted in their country?
Yeah, I mean, it brings a lot of attention to the country, and as we know from the 1936 Olympics, this kind of in Berlin, this was kind of bad for Hitler and the Nazi regime at the time, even though they weren't entirely in power. They had to cover up a lot of things that they were doing, like their anti-Jewish propaganda, and so it could be a very it brings a lot of spotlight onto a country, especially with a large tourist and media coverage. So it could bring a lot of pressure, and so you gotta make sure your country looks. I believe sometime there was during an Olympics, I'm not sure which country, but I'm pretty sure it was a relatively poor country. They built a wall along the slums so that people when driving to the Olympic Stadium couldn't see the slums. And I think that's
Rio.
Rio, I believe. Did you mention that?
I've not mentioned that, but that is a very good point.
Yeah, it brings a lot of spotlight onto a country, which is not good. Which could be a blessing, important. Could be a blessing, or it could be a curse, depending on how your country is acting.
Well, I think it's good for it. Even for Rio, it was beneficial to have spotlight on that country. Yes, they had to clean up, and it's not a good thing that they had to move people out of their homes because they lived in homes that weren't structurally well, didn't look pretty compared to the rest of the city. And that's not beneficial for them, but economically for the country, it was very good to have spotlight on Rio. So to your point, yes, it could be a very good thing for countries. It almost always is, but sometimes you do have to do cleanup like they did in Rio, which is good for from an economical standpoint. It's very good for Rio. However, the people that were moved out of their homes, that was not a very good thing for them. However, some of them did get to stay and were built better homes because they did protest against the removal of them in a democracy like Brazil.
Yeah.
So I think this wraps it up. Sam, do you have any thoughts?
I think I'm done.
All right, then we'll Sam, you want to lead us out?
All right. Well, this has been Team Stock Politics. We'll see you on Friday. Bye.